Hello, and welcome back to the Against the Stream podcast. My name is Hamid Alizadeh, and I'm here today one more time with Jorge Martín. We will be discussing the events of the past few weeks, in particular, the question of Gaza, where a ceasefire deal looks to be imminent. We will be discussing Donald Trump and his America First policy, his foreign policy. And then we'll be discussing the question of the crisis of the European Union and also Trump's friend Elon Musk intervening in the political life of European countries. Now, to start with the latest, in Gaza, there seems to be a ceasefire agreement agreed. This has come quite suddenly, you can say, in the past few days, and we'll go into the background of this. But the deal basically means a phased withdrawal of Israeli troops out of Gaza. It means the release of about 1,000 Hamas fighters who sit in Israeli prisons, as well as hundreds of others who've been in Israeli
arrested
prisons
since October the 8th.
Yes. In exchange for the release of the remaining hostages, some of them alive, some of them dead, by Hamas, and basically a restoration of Gaza as an autonomous entity run by Hamas, in many ways, we could say. And we'll get back to what that essentially means. Before that, however, I just have to do something, which is our air conditioning, our heating system started going, and I'm sure that's not going to sound very well to our listeners. But now, before we go into this deal, what it means really, I think we should just reiterate what has happened in in Gaza in the past 15 months. We have a situation where officially 46,707 people have been killed.
There was another report last week in the Lancet, again making the point that the real figure of people killed is probably much higher.
Yes. There's an article in The Guardian today, which goes through all of the destruction that Gaza has suffered, which is quite a harrowing article to read, really. I'm just going to say the facts which are at the end of the article. But I think people should look through the article itself. Now, this is 46,000 people whose bodies have been found and confirmed. Out of these, 13,000 children. Another 11,000 are believed, known people are believed to be caught underneath rubble of destroyed buildings and facilities. 110,000 people have been injured. 1.9 million people, 90% of the population of the area, have been displaced. Healthcare facilities has been attacked 654 times. This is just a figure. In reality, the realities of the matter is far starker than we can convey with these figures. 1,060 health workers killed, 534 schools damaged or destroyed. That's 95% of all schools in Gaza. 660,000 children are out of formal school education. I can't go to school. That's more or less all of the whole children population. 92% of the total of all homes have been destroyed or damaged. That's 436,000. And what they say is not just this, but also the cumulative effects. The pollution, the destruction of sewage, the destruction of the malnutrition. The vast majority of children today have experienced hunger and malnutrition, which will stunt their growth for the whole of their lives. And obviously the horrors of war that's been imposed on this population, which is going to sit with the Palestinian people for decades and decades to come, and is going to be a trauma that's going to haunt the people of Palestine as many other traumas, but this one's perhaps the worst.
Yeah, I mean, you're quoting from The Guardian here, but yesterday I watched the news on the BBC News. The BBC News was biased in favor of Israel, as it usually is, but nevertheless, they had a report from inside Gaza, and this report was incredible. They said that 1.8 million people are destitute, i.e. people who don't have necessary means for living from one day to another. And they were giving one example. There was a father with 4 young kids, and they lived by sending the kids into this rubbish heap and trying to find things that they could then sell for food. And they said, look, we live here. They lived in a tent, ramshackle tent. And they said, there's no toilets here. So at night, we come out all together. We come out to relieve ourselves. And last night, we were attacked by dogs, rabid dogs, in this heap of rubbish. I mean, these are the daily conditions now for, as you said, 1.9 million people. 90% of the population of Gaza have been displaced because their homes, one, because their homes have been destroyed by airstrikes. 2, because the IDF has been telling people to move. Now move south. This is a safe area. Then they bombed that safe area. Then they told them to move. Hundreds of thousands of people have been forced to move several times.
Yeah.
So even if there is a ceasefire, I mean, once it gets underway, because it's not even properly signed, but once the ceasefire gets underway, what's the conditions that the people in Gaza are going to have to live in? I mean, the buildings have been completely destroyed. There's nothing left. You said 600 schools, but all of the universities have been destroyed. The main hospitals have been destroyed. It's really, when we say that this wasn't just a war or is a genocide, the attempt to destroy the whole of the Gaza Strip with its population. And at some points, they even wanted to, if they could have gotten away with it, to displace the whole of the population out of the area.
Yeah, exactly. And then the question obviously comes, when we look at this deal, this is a deal that was almost exactly the same as a deal that was reached in May of last year. So almost a year ago. This deal has been on the table. I'm sure they could have even reached that before that. Yeah. And yet, all of this destruction has taken place in this amount of time. For what? And with the full, we should say, not just carried out by Israel. We've said this many times, but it needs to be said, with the full backing and support of the United States and of all Western governments.
Yeah. I mean, yesterday there was a press release by David Lammy, the British Foreign Affairs, and he was congratulating himself for this ceasefire. But this is completely cynical. Yeah. They voted against the ceasefire at the United Nations, and not only this, they are the British are not only complicit; they are participants in the destruction or in the genocide in Gaza. There are intelligence flights of the RAF from the Cyprus bases onto Gaza every single day. Yeah. So they're providing the intelligence, which is then used by the Israelis to bomb the hell out of the population in Israel. And now they all congratulating themselves for this ceasefire, which in fact, as you say, was already on the table in May last year and was sabotaged at every single step. It was sabotaged by whom? By Netanyahu.
Yeah. And they supported him. They went with him. It's not like they called him out and said. In fact, that's the interesting part about what we're going to go into now, is that the coming together of this deal was quite unheard of, really. It's unprecedented, because it was not an official American envoy or a diplomat or president or politician who got this deal together. It was actually a private individual. His name is Stephen Witkoff. He is a real estate developer and a friend of Donald Trump. And he was sent to the Middle East on behalf of Trump to push this deal together. Now, you were telling me this morning about how
There was a report. I'm not sure where it appeared first, but I read it in the Guardian. And apparently there was one. I mean, the Netanyahu has been trying to sabotage such a deal all the time. Back in May, in June, in September, all the time, and even the last few weeks.
Yeah.
Trump said that he wanted a deal before his inauguration, which take place in 4 days' time, 4 or 5 days' time, Monday, and. Netanyahu was trying to sabotage it again, bringing new issues and this and that. Incidentally, the reason Netanyahu gave for sabotaging the deal back in June last year was the withdrawal of the IDF from the Philadelphia corridor.
Yes.
The withdrawal of which he didn't want to accept.
Yes.
Now, this is part of the deal, and he's accepted it. Yes. Well, I mean, he's not signed it yet, but anyway. So the point is that at one point last week or early this week, no, last week, Witkoff, is that his name? Witkoff was in Qatar, in Doha, where these talks were taking place. And then Netanyahu was trying to sabotage this. And then Witkoff called Netanyahu's office and said, okay, I'm coming and I want to talk to Netanyahu. And the other one said, oh, but it's the Sabbath and can this not wait? They were trying to delay the whole thing. And then he said, no, I don't care about any of this. I'm coming. And he went there, he met with Netanyahu and his people from his security cabinet, and he told them in no uncertain terms that this deal had to be signed. And apparently quite strong words were exchanged at this meeting, because the official report says, what does it say?
It says it was a tense meeting.
A tense meeting.
Now, in the word, in diplomatic jargon, a tense meeting is basically a row. It's basically where chairs are flying through the roof.
Because otherwise they will say a frank exchange of opinion.
Well, and below that is a respectful, mutually respectful.
So anyway, this is the situation that we have. One where but Biden's trying to claim responsibility for this deal, take credit for this deal. And I saw him in the press conference yesterday when they asked him, did Trump play a role in this? And he said, is this a joke? Yeah. But in reality, the fact is that this deal was on the table in May. Yeah. And Biden, instead of taking any decisive action to force Netanyahu to accept it, he sided with Netanyahu all along. Yeah. He made some complaints publicly, but continued to fund, arm, provide intelligence, security, defense, and everything. And he couldn't bring himself to separate himself one single inch from the position of Netanyahu. And Netanyahu knew this. He knew he had a blank check from Biden, and he completely ignored any attempts by Biden to say, oh, maybe you should sign, maybe polite attempts to tell him off. And he just went ahead and sabotaged the deal all along. And it's only been the intervention of Trump, for whatever reasons, which we can discuss, but it's really been the decisive intervention of Trump's envoy and Trump himself that has changed the balance and is forced, not willingly, but forced Netanyahu to sign this ceasefire.
Yes, because we before even coming to power, I mean, how strange is that? Last week, Trump made this ominous threat into the ether on Twitter. He said, if these hostages aren't back by the time I get into office, all hell will break out in the Middle East. It will not be good for Hamas or anybody else. And by anybody else, it's clear that he meant Israel.
And by the way, this threat, which apparently was also aimed at Hamas, wouldn't have had much impact on Hamas, because the Israelis have intelligence on Gaza. The US doesn't have the hands-on intelligence. The US wouldn't have been able to do anything more than what Israel is already doing in pounding Gaza. But and also, Hamas had already accepted this deal back in May last year. They were already ready to accept this deal. But this was a threat to Netanyahu in reality.
That's what it was. And this is what we get to in a moment, is essentially the contours of a new foreign policy of America first, so to say, and American primacy, maybe we can call it, which is Joe Biden's mantra. But before we get to that, there is the question of the impact what does this deal mean in Israel? Because we've spoken about this often, that one of the main driving forces of this war, if not the main driving force, was Benjamin Netanyahu's desire to
self-preservation.
For self-preservation. Netanyahu, over the past decade, more or less a decade and a half, has become a very divisive figure in Israeli politics. And his focus on staying in power has meant that he has whipped up a whole series of forces that he can't really control. He's whipped up this far-right, ultra semi-fascist, ultra-orthodox settlers
who are in his cabinet.
And in the meantime, he has antagonized a big part of the more, let's say, liberal-leaning part of the population who hate him. Now,
and also an important section of the ruling class.
And an important section of the ruling class. And he's destabilized Israeli society in a way. And very often he's been quite close to being deposed or being basically not elected or losing power in one way or another, which means that he's played the Palestine card, he's playing the Gaza card, he's attacked Gaza on several occasions. And he's basically used this war card, this whipping up a war hysteria for his own individual benefit, which is...
And then when Gaza wasn't enough, then he invaded Lebanon, he attacked Israel, he bombed Syria, and so on.
Now, the Israeli ruling class is intent, or a big chunk of it, is intent of getting him down and getting him out, basically. But he relies on these... Now, part of the reasons why he started this war, and he's been continuing it, the war with Lebanon, is precisely because as long as there's a war, there's a national unity cabinet. The ruling class realizes they can't be seen as divided. A defeat for Israel would also be a defeat for them. But this situation does not leave him in a very good situation because none of his war aims have been reached.
That's right.
We talked about Lebanon, that Hezbollah was forced to sign a ceasefire. It was a victory in a way, but Hezbollah remains. It remains alive. It remains probably all over Lebanon, even in the areas where it's not supposed to be. And now in Gaza, you have Hamas that similarly is not only remains, but is rebuilding. Now,
in fact, this was one of the main aims of the war, from stated aims of the war from the point of view of Israel. One was the release of all hostages, which they have not achieved. And number two was have not achieved by war means. And number two was the destruction of Hamas. The physical the elimination of Hamas. This is in fact what Smotrich, the far-right finance minister, is telling Netanyahu today. He's saying, no, I'm not going to sign for this. I'm not going to vote for this in the cabinet because this deal does not provide for the smashing as elimination of Hamas.
Yes, exactly. Now, in the Wall Street Journal on the 13th, so that's 3 days ago, there's an article called "Hamas has another Sinwar and he's rebuilding." Now, Yahya Sinwar, the former leader of Hamas, was killed a few months ago. His younger brother, Mohammed Sinwar, I believe he's called, is now leading Hamas on the ground. Not externally, but on the ground. And this is what the Wall Street Journal writes. He says, the well-trained and well-armed cadres of Hamas who surged into southern Israel on October 7, 2023 are badly weakened. But the violence has also created a new generation of willing recruits and littered Gaza with unexploded ordnance that Hamas fighters can refashion into improvised bombs. The militant group is using the tools to continue to inflict pain. The Israeli military in the past week has reported 10 deaths among soldiers in the area of Beit Hanun in northern Gaza. Hamas has also fired some 20 rockets at Israel in the past 2 weeks. So much for pacifying Hamas. The recruitment drive and persistent fighting under Sinwar pose a fresh challenge for Israel. Its military has battered the group in Gaza, but for months has had to return to areas it previously cleared of militants to take them on again in new fighting. That cycle points to the difficulty of ending a war that has exhausted Israel's troops and continues to imperil hostages still held in Gaza. Just to finish, This is a quote. "We are in a situation where the pace at which Hamas is rebuilding itself is higher than the pace that the IDF is eradicating them," end quote, said Amir Avivi, a retired Israeli brigadier general, referring to the Israeli Defense Forces. Mohammad Sinwar is managing everything.
This is what we said at the beginning,
Yes.
isn't it? Smashing Hamas or smashing Hezbollah is not possible. It's not possible to do that by military means. In fact, the very brutal nature of the genocidal campaign of the IDF in Gaza is acting, as this article specifically says, as a recruiting sergeant for Hamas.
Yes.
It's obvious. It can never be destroyed in that way. And therefore, Israel has failed in its war aims. And this will sink in Israeli public opinion, sooner or later, will have a damaging effect for Netanyahu's future.
Not only that, you see, they started the war, and throughout they've been carrying themselves in a very bombastic manner. We are the big, the big, powerful military force. We've been pounding tens of thousands of bombs onto the heads of the Gazans. Nothing can stop us. And they're in there, the soldiers are there, hundreds of thousands of them, or tens of thousands of them, every day, day after day after day. And they start getting tired. Some of their comrades die, are killed. Not a huge amount, but enough to instill terror inside of them. This idea that we're the boys, no one can touch us, it begins to dissipate. We've talked about the declining rate of people showing up for military service. In the beginning, it was 100%. Recently, it was 80%? You could maybe remember that better than me.
But then I read a more recent figure from Haaretz yesterday. It said that since June, turn up for conscript soldiers has gone down another 15 to 20%.
Yes. And that has in fact sparked, this has become a part of a bigger conflict that predates this question, which is that as it is now, the Haredi settlers are exempt from military service in Israel. In Israel, everyone has to go in for 2 years. It's quite a big burden, but the Haredis have been exempt because they believe that they should not do this. They should dedicate their life to just studying the Torah. That's the ultra-orthodox methods. Now, in June, the Supreme Court ruled that is illegal and that they should be drafted in. And I believe so far 3,000 maybe have drafted in, a very small amount. And then there's been talk about gradually raising this. This has put the Netanyahu government in a big crisis because his main supporters on the right are from these gangs, you can say. But at the same time, the needs of the army, which is losing men that it can't replenish, is increasing. The amount of PTSD, one is people dying, but wounded, mentally, psychologically impaired people who can't participate. All these casualties mean that they need that. So there's a conflict here between continuing this onslaught, which is going nowhere really. Everyone can see it, and which is now pulling in this open gaping wound inside of the government itself.
And then on top of this, there's this question of the conscription of the Haredim. There's the whole other political question that for months now, the big majority of the families of the hostages have been against the war. Yeah. And they've been pushing and demonstrating, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of people demonstrating for a ceasefire deal. Yeah. Because even from a practical point of view, you see the only time in which hostages have been released is when there was a short ceasefire months ago, more than a year ago, and 100 people were released. Yeah. And then 2 or 3 of them who managed to escape. And I think maybe, 2 or 3 that have been actually rescued by the IDF, but no more than that. Yes. And so even from a practical point of view, from the practical point of view of the families of the hostages, they want the hostages, the relatives back. And they know the only way is to talk to Hamas. Yeah. And the idiocy and lunacy of Netanyahu, who wants to continue the war, as you said, just to keep himself in power, which is now obvious and apparent to the majority of the population in Israel, has created a mass opposition against him.
And interestingly enough, the Haredim, the Orthodox, want to continue. They want to eradicate the Palestinians entirely, They want to settle the Gaza again.
But they don't want to serve.
But they don't want to serve. So this is ripping Israeli society. These are the contours. Obviously, in a war situation, which we're still in, this is not visible. But these divisions, which were there before, will come back if this ceasefire is signed with a massive force. And on top of that, we have to say, the Israeli economy is completely destroyed. Is in a deep crisis. In the north, people have not really moved back. Those who were evacuated from near the Lebanese border. And as we've said before, the damage to the Israeli psychology, that this state can defend us, all of these things have disappeared. Israel is in a very, very weak state. And in this situation, I don't think, in fact, that Netanyahu was in a position to say no to Trump. Because if Trump wants to cut off arms, that's it.
That's the end of it.
And economically, also, they need America more than anything. Although I think it will be difficult to build up because their economy, the Israeli economy, is a high-end economy. And it means if you want to invest in a place where you need engineers, you need very, very advanced, skilled workers, you need to have stability. But with that gone, that means a gradual erosion.
Some Israeli technology companies have already moved out of Israel.
So what we're talking about is the erosion of the basis of the Israeli society, or in the medium and long term.
And this is related to another point because you see, some people are asking, so how was Trump able to force Netanyahu to sign this deal, which he resisted for all these months? And some people are saying, well, he must have threatened him, which is obvious. But he must have given him some carrot. And it's difficult to see what carrot is he offered him, But in Trump's speech after the ceasefire was announced, he mentioned the extension, the continuation of the Abraham Accords, i.e. the process by which the Arab countries normalize relations with Israel, which was signed under the previous Trump administration. And this is important for the Israeli ruling class. Why? Because that will open normal trading relations to a big market in the Middle East that they could tap into. Now, whether this will be achieved or not is much more complicated than this. But from a point of view, a section of the Israeli ruling class, this is the way forward, isn't it? To reestablish normal trading relations with the Arab countries so that the economy can be buoyant again.
But whatever happens, I think what we're going to see is a very unstable Israel. I mean, Israel has been, you can say, in a permanent crisis since its inception. But I think we reached a qualitatively new stage where the old unity that, you see, the Israeli ruling class created a false unity in a way, by saying to the Israeli workers that we can defend you against these rabid Arabs and these enemies. But now, internal fractions are opening up. This is not yet on a class basis. This is along different lines, sectarian lines in some ways, you can say. But nevertheless, in the future, this will also create the conditions for the rise of the class struggle.
I think so. Yesterday in the BBC report, they were saying this war has left both sides, i.e. the Israelis and the Palestinians, much more with a higher level of distrust from each other. It says it's radicalized the Israeli society against the Palestinians more than it was before. And it's obviously radicalized the Palestinians, that they don't trust the Israelis, quite rightly so. But I think that that's a bit superficial because it's only logical that for Israeli Jews, as this idea is broken, that the state of Israel guarantees their security and guarantees their high living standards. This is broken now. The idea that there's the only way for them to live in safety and peace in the region is by reaching a democratic deal with the Palestinians must be, at some point, must penetrate into the minds of Israeli Jewish workers and youth, I'd say.
Yes. Now, let's move on to Trump, because as you said before, how did Trump do this? This is we can say a first taste of Trump's foreign policy. Trump has been saying America first, and the question is, what does that mean? Now, there is a podcast episode in the Financial Times. It was called Will Trump pull America back from the world? It was recorded on the 12th of December, so a little while ago. But it's very, very interesting and revealing. And it's written by someone who's become, his name is Dan what's his name? Let me find it. Caldwell, yes, yeah. Caldwell. He's become quite prominent. He is a ex-Marine, ex-US Army soldier.
Served in Iraq.
Now he works as a think tank person. I don't know. Analyst or strategist for something called... I've written it down here, but I've forgotten it. He works for a think tank. I'll get the name in a minute. Which is incidentally funded by the Koch brothers, who are big-time billionaire industrialists and old-time Republicans. And it's quite revealing what he says about Trump's foreign policy. First of all, I'll just there's a transcript of it on the FT's website as well. But he says, I have to say, a lot of times when President Trump is railing against American foreign policy failures, he is his most focused and righteously angry. And that really appealed to me in 2016. And I know that the word crime is very strong, but that's all I can call it. He calls the Iraq war a crime, a war that he participated in and lost friends to, most probably. It led, he says, he talks about the Iraq war, says, it led to the deaths of likely up to 1 million Arabs, Iraqis, and Syrians, Kurds as well. This is the first time a high-end US official, or official person at least, says something like this. It destroyed Christian minorities in Iraq. You know, it likely led to the exodus of up to 1 million Christians from Iraq. Whatever you can say about Saddam, and he was an awful tyrant, but he did allow a degree of religious pluralism in Iraq that essentially no longer exists. You had over 4,000 Americans killed who were in uniform. Several thousand more who were contractors were killed. You had tens of thousands of wounded. These were wounds that will affect them the rest of their lives. It will cause them pain. It will cause them challenges for the rest of their lives. It will impact their families. And then you had hundreds of thousands more veterans who suffered unseen wounds. It's commonly known here as post-traumatic stress disorder. You could argue it too as moral injury. Hundreds of thousands of those veterans, their lives have been irreparably changed as a result of that. And that impacted communities, wives, mothers, sons, daughters. The scale of the suffering that war inflicted, I think, is often either ignored or understated. And then he gets to another side of this thing, which is, and putting aside the human suffering for a second, the monetary cost was significant. Over $2 trillion and counting, because the Iraq war is still going on. And since the October 7th attacks, I believe you've had nearly 100 troops wounded in Iraq by attacks by Iranian militias, who, by the way, are technically part of the Iraqi government that we are funding and training. So this is an ongoing conflict that is born out of arguably one of the worst foreign policy decisions in American history, and may turn out to be the worst. And then he goes on basically and condemns those who fought the Iraq war. This is quite.
This is not just him.
Yes.
There's a whole layer of people who are around Trump, and Trump voices this opinion, who start from that point of view.
Yes.
The U.S. military adventures or military aggression in Iraq and Afghanistan was wrong.
Yes.
Didn't lead to any positive outcome, and it was a waste of money and resources and lives. And this was a big mistake. This is the starting point. So there is a very Trump in a certain way gives voice to strong opposition, deep-seated opposition amongst the American public to foreign military adventures which have not worked.
Exactly. And we've said many times that those wars, which were quite unnecessary, they weren't forced onto America. They weren't within the core interests or anything like that. Far from it wasn't just a defeat that America suffered in not winning, but they actually built up, as I said, this resentment, this hatred of these military adventures, and this opposition towards, which has severely hampered America's ability to intervene. Now, continuing on for this, the consequences of this, he sums up quite interestingly. He says, the United States exists in a world where its power is more limited than it's been since the end of the Cold War, and arguably before that. We simply cannot afford financially, militarily, and on an industrial level to keep doing all the things we're trying to do around the world without risking a financial catastrophe. And we have no choice but to prioritize. I really believe that foreign policy these days for the United States is a matter not of what we should do, but what we can do. And I think
that this is the most important part. Yes. As I was listening to this podcast, my eyes were open like this. I said, "Oh, this is extremely clear." And what he's saying is, there's been a relative decline. This is the point we've been making. There's been a relative decline of the power of U.S. imperialism, and there are things that U.S. imperialism can do. There are things that cannot afford to do, and it shouldn't attempt to do.
In fact, I think we're allowed to blow our trumpets a little bit, because I remember not so long ago I was reading some of the articles that Alan Woods wrote during the time of the Iraq War, and I remember one of the subheaders was "Pride comes before the fall," i.e., the arrogance of the Americans in wading into Iraq and in Afghanistan. Precipitated their own decline, and that's what we're seeing. That the American imperialism has reached a limit. Politically, it's bound itself into knots that it can't get out of. It's in a serious political crisis with divisions, right and left throughout the political establishment, financially and militarily. I think that we get to that, but this person, it reflects a mood of demoralization amongst a large layer of the military. And Napoleon always said, morale is 9/10 of all wars. With the ability of America to succeed. And in fact, which war has America won in the past 20 years? I mean, I guess apart from the first Iraq war, that's more than 20 years. There's nothing. It's lost. Every military adventure has ended up in a disaster, which means that it can't assert itself as much as it has before. And the reasons, there are other reasons besides its own limitations. But the majority is basically creating conditions by its own doing. And the other thing, as you said, we've been pointing out for a long time, is a relative decline. What does that mean? That means the America that went from being 50% of the world's manufacturing, 50-some% of the world's GDP in the post-war period, has gone to now 16% of the world's manufacturing, and I think 25% maybe of the world's GDP. Then you have powers like China, which has come up as an economic force. And you have powers like Russia, which has now become a major military force. In fact, again, accelerated, a process that was accelerated by the intervention of America in Ukraine. And that means that the Americans can't just do what they did. They can't just wade into another country. They can't. Everywhere where they go, they see that while they are the strongest power on the planet, they're not the strongest dominant power everywhere all at once. In fact, in most areas, they're not the strongest power. If the other powers gang up together in the Southeast Asia, China has become stronger. In Ukraine, they are ganging up with the Europeans, and they've lost. In the Middle East, they have had, they have had serious defeats inflicted on them by Iran and Russia together. And the situation in Israel, as we see now, again, is a sign of their limitations. And Donald Trump is realizing this. He's saying, yes, we are limited. And our task is not to defend our allies, but is protect our own interests with the limited force that we have.
In fact, as this person, Caldwell, is that his name? Yeah. As this person says, you have to go back to the end of the Cold War, right? At the end of the Cold War, the US was the world's policeman and it dominated the whole world,
Yes.
right? I remember the first Gulf War in 1991. The U.S. went into that war with the umbrella, with the covering of the UN resolution, which Russia voted in favor, and China abstained. Now, 30 years later, this is 35 years later, this is unthinkable. Russia and China will never will never allow a situation like that. And this reflects a changed balance of forces.
Yes.
And as you say, the difference between Biden and Trump is that Biden refuses to recognize this and still wants to go to war, a proxy war with Russia, weaken Russia, regime change in Russia, impose the interests of Israel throughout the Middle East. And he wants to be everywhere and at the same time when it's unable to do. And Trump has said, no, wait a minute, we cannot do all of these things. Maybe we should concentrate on strengthening our core base. And then we'll see about the rest. And this is more or less the meaning of Trump's speech last week when he was going on about the Panama Canal, Greenland, Canada, Mexico, and all that.
Yeah, those are the near abroad of America.
The core security interests of the U.S. imperialism.
To trade, related to mineral wealth. And this person says, he said, I'm not advocating for embracing or accepting American decline. He does accept that it exists, but he doesn't say they should live with it. He says, I'm advocating the opposite, that we need to do things to reverse American decline. And I guess that's pretty correct from their point of view. He says, and I think our pursuit of primacy, now by primacy he means to dominate every single country and every area and every region. Which is exactly what, as you say, Biden has been doing, has ultimately made us weaker as a country. It has led us to undertake foreign misadventures like the Iraq War, to stay much longer in Afghanistan, to attempt to turn one of those most tribal nations of the world into a nation with a history of... sorry, I'm just going to jump here because...
Well, he says a nation with a history of fighting foreign enemies, which is a point that Engels made in the 1880s.
Yes, so Marxism, we're far ahead of these guys. That those misadventures have made us weaker. They've made us weaker militarily by wearing us down a lot of our most important military assets, by costing us thousands of lives, and also by forcing us to build a military that isn't actually focused on the real challenges, mainly what we're dealing with in the Pacific, that's China and Russia. For 20 years, we've essentially built a counterinsurgency military, i.e., we prioritize investing in the army, the ground troops, in other words. We prioritize investments in systems that were designed to fight tribal fighters. And we neglected our Navy and our Air Force and other things that we need that were more critical, in my view, to actually preserving the core American interests. And American physical safety and the conditions of our economic prosperity, i.e. the interests of American capitalism. And then, not to mention, it has likely added upwards to $10 trillion to our national debt. Just one thing to stop here. This question of the U.S. Army is extremely advanced army. It's highly advanced, extremely expensive. But we see in Ukraine precisely that it's not built for war, for conventional war against a equal opponent. Whereas Russia has built a million-man strong army, several million-man strong army, in fact, built for conventional war against America and a defense against America, whereas the high-tech equipment of the Americans is just going to grounds in the cold and the mud and
and the other interesting point that he makes is this: that in fact is not that they are in favor of peace and friendship, but that they want to withdraw from areas that they do not consider the core interest of the U.S. national security and concentrate on the main enemy in the Pacific.
Yes, it's China.
In China, which is the main rival in this inter-imperialist competition in the world.
Yes, exactly. Now, to continue what it means concretely, in Ukraine, he says, when asked about Ukraine, he says, this is again a point that we made. Again, Alan Woods made that point right in the beginning of this conflict. He says, this is an absolutely unnecessary conflict from the point of view of American imperialism. i.e., America does not have any vital interests at stake in Ukraine.
In Ukraine, yes.
And he says the same thing. I do not think we have vital national interests at stake. If we do have one interest at stake in the moment, it's actually a result of our own over-involvement in that conflict. Mm-hmm. And that is, we have an interest of it not escalating into a nuclear confrontation with Russia, mm-hmm. which Biden has increasingly mm-hmm. been edging towards. Mm-hmm. And I think there is heightened risk to that because we've gotten too involved in that conflict as a country. The Biden administration has, particularly the last 6 months, undertaken many policies that I view as an unnecessarily escalatory. Mm-hmm. And they really stem out of a decision by the Biden administration, and it predates Biden administration, to treat Ukraine like it is a core national interest, when I don't think any reasonable assessment of the country would lead us to believe that it is absolutely critical for American safety and prosperity, i.e. American capitalism. Mm-hmm. But right now, it has cost the United States, if you're counting the money spent to deploy troops to Eastern Europe and the intelligence support we're getting, $170 billion since February 2022. And he goes on to say that, he says, in reality, what we achieved was we're destroying Ukraine as a nation. He says he went to Odessa mm-hmm. and he couldn't find any men. Mm-hmm. All the young men were away, mm-hmm. were nowhere to be seen. And the only men he could find were recruitment officers.
Yeah.
And here's the interesting part, because obviously this is not a communist speaking. Mm-hmm. This is a representative of a wing of American capitalism, mm-hmm. of the Koch brothers, of an industrialist wing of them, mm-hmm. but also of a bit more sober-headed wing, perhaps, than the Biden wing. He says, the current path that Ukraine is on right now, I don't think is a viable country if this continues much longer, whether economically, demographically, or whatnot. But to answer your questions, and not to dodge it, he's been asked about Ukraine. What about Ukraine, right? He says, the war is a tragedy, but for the United States, whether or not Russia controls Donbas or Crimea is not a vital interest of us. Mm-hmm. And that's just, he's putting it in this way, right? But this, I will say that this is clearly the thinking of Trump and the Trump administration that's coming in. Yes, exactly. The division of the world in spheres of influence, yes. Maintaining itself, America as the strongest force, but not challenging everyone all at the same time. Everywhere in the world. Yes. Can I just say that there's a couple of observations that I was thinking about this. The first one is, isn't it ironic that all the media are saying a vote for Trump in the United States was a shift to the right in public opinion, yes. as if Biden was somehow left. Yes. And in fact, you take the conflict in the genocide in Gaza, and the one that has pushed Netanyahu to sign a ceasefire, which is not a solution to the problem, but at least they stop bombing it's Trump. Yeah. And Biden was against and was backing Netanyahu. So, these things... They said Trump was Hitler. It was a new Hitler. Yes, do you remember? That's right. And I've seen other reports. A lot of people in the United States voted for Trump in disgust at Biden's warmongering in Gaza, or didn't vote for Harris because of the policy in Gaza. So, the terms... right and left. Yes, Trump is a reactionary demagogue, but that doesn't mean that Biden is a left-wing peace dove or anything like this. Exactly. And I think that's quite significant. The other thing I think is significant is, as he explains it and as Trump is expressing it, this also means a tearing up of the rules-based order facade that existed before. Yes. In the past, US imperialism will go to war here and there, but they will always do it in the name of, human rights, international law, national sovereignty. Trump doesn't really care about any of that. He says Greenland must be part of the United States. It's our national security interest. He doesn't really care whether Greenland is part of Denmark or not, whether this is violating sovereignty. He doesn't even care about all these niceties, which in the past,
didn't exist either, because the
Yeah.
United States was invading countries left, right, and center, but was using it as a cover for justifying the crimes of imperialism. In that sense, Trump is expressing, these are the interests of US imperialism. We don't care about nations, borders, or anything. These are it is our interests. We're going to achieve them. At least he is being honest about it.
He's tearing away the veil, which is why they hate him.
And not only this, by tearing away the veil, this means that he's giving arguments to Putin. Putin says, okay, Ukraine being part of NATO or having nuclear weapons by a foreign power is a threat to our national security interest. And Trump says he is right. He's right.
Exactly.
That's his national security interest. My national security interest is the Panama Canal and Greenland.
And Putin's got to stay away from those. Now, he also goes on to talk about Europe. He says, because Trump has said he's going to pull out of NATO. He said, well, we're not going to pull out of NATO. But he says they will have to carry a bigger part of the burden themselves, i.e., and it's true in a way, because the fact that America has put up the military defense of Europe has meant that European capitalism could invest in production, such as Germany. A big part of the economic growth in Europe in the past 50 years would not have been there if European capitalist nations had to spend that amount of money on defense. So they're ramping that up. But also what is interesting is, we talk about Greenland. Trump wants to take over, annex Greenland from a NATO country, right?
Will that trigger Article 5?
Yeah. But again, this person, Dan Caldwell, he expresses a truth of international politics, of international relations that we've always said. He says, I don't think you should ever take something like pulling out of NATO off the table. He says, first of all, we're not going to do it, but we shouldn't take it off the table. I don't think alliances should be viewed as holy sacraments. It's worth noting that George Washington, in his farewell address, went out of his way to warn against maintaining permanent alliances. Alliances are means to an end. They're not an end in themselves. And we should always be reevaluating our alliances. And so what does this mean? He says, we're not there to prop up the European ruling class. We have our own fish to fry. In fact, this is what Trump is saying. You got to give us some of your business, some of your industry, some of, with this, with the tariffs that they're putting up, with all of the things that they're, and in fact, not only that, you have to raise your defense budgets and buy arms from America, which is because that's where the majority of the defense is
from 2 to 4% or 5% of GDP. Yeah.
Yes. So that's and obviously, if I was a European capitalist somewhere in Brussels or in Berlin or Paris,
I'd be worried.
I would be quite worried because you have Russia right next door. Not that Russia is going to invade Eastern Europe; it's not going to do that. But politically and economically, Russia can now flex its money. It's clear that they won in Ukraine. They won.
Yeah.
And the Europeans will have to pay for it one way or another. And that means succumbing also to Russian pressure and also economically succumbing to American pressure. So in essence, what we see is we're going to see the pillaging, the falling apart of Europe. We're already seeing the beginnings of it.
Yes, we have talked in the past about the relative decline of US imperialism and the rise of new imperialist powers, Russia and China. At the same time, there's another process going on, which is the long-term decline of European imperialism.
Yes,
that's clear.
Precisely. Now, to continue to the next flashpoint, talks about China. And obviously, if you say that the United States has a sphere of influence, Russia has a sphere of influence, you can't get around the fact that
China has a sphere of
China
influence.
must also have a sphere of influence of its own. And it seems to me that what they're saying is that they will accept that. But obviously, China is a direct competitor to America. And giving China a sphere of influence doesn't guarantee that it will stay within a sphere of influence. And
I think what he was trying to say is also that there is a division in the Trump camp between those who think that China is just an economic rival and those who think it's also a military rival.
Yes, exactly. And then there's the question of Taiwan, because Taiwan is of crucial importance in all of this for China. China needs Taiwan to make sure that it's to break its isolation, its geographic isolation. It wants Taiwanese chip manufacturing technologies, and militarily also is very, very important. You can either use it to box in China or for China to break out and into the Pacific on a naval basis. And what this person, and up until now, the policy of the United States has been, on the one hand, saying, well, we don't support or
any change
or
in the
reject.
status quo.
So they support the status quo.
Yeah.
But they've been edging towards a more and more provocative stance towards China. Inside of Taiwan, the DPP, which is the main U.S. puppet, the government there
Like
has
Nancy Pelosi's visit, there's some statements that we will defend Taiwan to the end.
And they've been whipping up this kind of hysteria. And obviously the question is, what will happen if China decides that they're going to take over Taiwan militarily? And this person says, I would not trade Taipei for Los Angeles. And what he means is that China is a nuclear power. A clash with China and America is a nuclear war. And China has nuclear bombs that would reach Los Angeles. From that point of view, he says, we would not want to have a conflict with China. However, we could make it very hard for them by giving them drones and military technology that could make it very costly for China to take over Taiwan. But in essence, it's a continuation of the general process of leaving each man for themselves, a redivision of the world, so an imperialist redivision of the world into spheres of influence between the three major powers and perhaps a few secondary ones like India, Indonesia, and so on and so forth.
Can I just say additionally that, in fact, there is nothing progressive in this. It's a change in the balance of forces amongst the relative strength of the different imperialist powers. It's a change that's happened, that Trump is more prepared to accept and act accordingly, that Biden was not prepared to accept and acted in a reckless manner from that point of view. But the fact that they now accepting this is not progressive in any way from the point of view of the working class. This is a 3 or 2 different gangs of imperialist robbers, and the ones who will come out losing out of this, the working class in the US, the working class in Russia, the working class in Europe, particularly the working class in China. So there are some people who say, no, a multipolar world is somehow more progressive because it will be more peaceful, or I don't know exactly what. It will allow the peoples of the world to have more independence and sovereignty. It's nothing like that. They'll be carved up between different imperialist powers.
And I will add to that, at the same time, however, I think lots of people around the world are rejoicing at seeing American imperialism being defeated, because
of course,
if there's one thing we can say about American imperialism is that there's never been a more reactionary force on the planet. There's not a country that America hasn't ravaged or tried to control one way or another.
In the last 150 years.
In the last 150, costing millions and millions of lives and destroying millions of lives. But we don't have much time, so we'll continue to our last point, which is there was an article in El País, in the Spanish paper.
An editorial
called "Democracy Itself is at Risk." And you wrote an article about this, which is on our website, Marxist.com, on the 14th of January.
Yeah, it was like a call to arms by the El País. El País is one of the main bourgeois newspapers, a mouthpiece of Spanish capitalism, Spanish multinational companies, and so on the liberal, progressive side. Yeah. And basically the headline screams, in a big headline, Europe must react. And what must Europe react to? Well, apparently, Elon Musk has been making all these comments. Elon Musk wants to overthrow Starmer in Britain, wants to change the government in Germany, and is intervening here, there, and everywhere. Yeah. So El País is scandalized. This is a scandal because these billionaire magnates, techno-populists, I think he calls they call him. They are interfering in the politics of Europe and this and that and so. And I'm thinking, wait a second. Elon Musk is entitled to his own opinion. And El País is also is a media outlet which is also owned by billionaires and investment funds. It's part of the Grupo Prisa, which controls radio stations in Spain, in 13 different Latin American countries. They also have control of the media. So what is the problem here? They have a different opinion than Elon Musk. But Elon Musk is surely entitled to his own, to make his own opinion viewed through the control of the media.
Yes.
Because El País is also representing a group of capitalist multimillionaires putting forward their own point of view. But no, apparently El País is complaining, they say, about disinformation. And I'm thinking, there's all this talk about disinformation through social media, and for instance, they just TikTok and all of these things. And I'm thinking, there's two things here. One, traditional media, in inverted commas, i.e. the traditional bourgeois newspapers, TV stations, are they not involved in disinformation? And these the people who told us that Saddam Hussein had weapons of mass destruction, a deliberate lie.
Yes.
El País in Spain has lied about Venezuela for 25 years straight. Deliberate lies. They even printed things that were wrong. Sometimes they were false, directly false. They were supported the coup in Venezuela in 2002. They were forced to publish a retraction about I don't know how many things. They also involved in disinformation, right? It's not just the new media that gives rise to disinformation. And the other thing is, why are people getting their news so much from social media these days, from WhatsApp, from Facebook, from Twitter, from TikTok? Because they don't trust, because this traditional media is so discredited because of their own lies that the people can believe almost anything that they tell them. And if people are told, oh, there's a conspiracy, the traditional media are conspiring to hide things, this actually is true.
It's true.
They correspond to their own experience and they believe it. So that is the real problem. The problem is not so much disinformation in new media or social media. The problem is the massive loss of legitimacy of the traditional bourgeois newspapers, which goes hand in hand with a lack of loss of legitimacy of all bourgeois institutions, bourgeois democracy, the monarchy, the church, the judiciary, the army, everyone. And this is really what El País is worried. But there's another angle in El País article editorial is that they complain and they say, oh, Europe must create its own technological platforms. And they mention the fact that the Italian army is now contracted Starlink, which is the satellite system of Elon Musk, for their own military purposes. And they say, and the problem is that Europe cannot offer an alternative. And this is kind of the impotent, the powerlessness of European capitalism. They can't do anything about this. They are divided. They are behind in technological development. And this is a reflection of the crisis of European capitalism, which Nicholas wrote an article on the website. It's concentrating on the car industry, but which is an explanation of the crisis of European capitalism in general. And
I would say there are 3 points that I would like to add to that. What this attack by Trump signifies, because I think on the one hand, it is a continuation of America First, in the sense that it's before the U.S. administration, the ruling class in the U.S. saw the West as one, kind of the center. And although they were at the top of this kind of pyramid, but nevertheless, Western capitalist powers, European capitalist powers were seen as kind of the inner circle of that. But here you see clearly that Trump is coming out, putting American interest straight ahead of everyone else. And I think this is also linked to the struggle, the fight against the deep state, so to say, that we saw in the US. Because in reality, these people are part of the same organism, if we can say. The American deep state, which is, these hundreds of, this huge bureaucratic apparatus.
The capitalist state, basically.
And political establishment that has been ruling America for the past, in the whole post-war period. So that's 75 years or 70 or 80 years. It's the same that's ruled Europe in many ways. In fact, if you look at it in these elections, the whole European establishment were behind Harris. All of them, every single one of them, and including El País, who then talks about people intervening in the elections of other countries. So this is a part of that struggle as well, because the struggle inside of NATO and the struggle inside all of these institutions, which Trump is fighting against, and what they're appealing, what him and Musk are appealing to, is what, on the other hand, the same thing that brought them to power in the US, which is a process that's brewing, and they're helping accelerating it, of mass dissatisfaction, class anger, right from the ground up, the economy, being at a dead end in the major countries is collapsing, is falling apart in Britain, in Germany, in France. The left obviously being totally discredited and having sold out again and again.
The so-called left.
The so-called left. The establishment parties, the liberals, the Democrats, all of these, again, discredited with all the cuts and attacks, the participation in the wars in Gaza and in Ukraine, all of these things, and people finding an outlet in these weird, peculiar formations, for lack of a better word, like an AfD, like Reform in Britain, like Le Pen's Rassemblement National in France,
the FPO in
the
Austria.
FPO in Austria, which are now coming to power, and Trump is and Musk is accelerating this as a part of their broader agenda, whether it's fighting to defend themselves and consolidate their power, or to consolidate American power. To accelerate these things, which will undermine the European Union, it will undermine NATO, it will undermine all of these things, and it will ultimately strengthen. It will concentrate power, economic, military, and political power, even more in Washington than it was before.
The other thing about this editorial in El País is that at the end, this is the liberals, the progressives, right? Yes. So at the end, they say, what can we do to prevent these techno-populist billionaire media owners from spreading disinformation? And they're basically saying that what we need is censorship.
Yes.
So in the name of freedom of expression, they're proposing censorship. And then in order to defend democracy, they're proposing what they did in Romania. In Romania, you had one of these outsiders, a reactionary demagogue, Georgescu, who won the first round of the election, right? The ruling Liberal Party came fifth, I think.
He won by being against the Ukraine war.
He won by being against the Ukraine war, by saying, why are we spending all this money in Ukraine when our own people have had to emigrate because of poverty and so on, to take care of our own. And
yes.
And he won through, his message was spread through a TikTok campaign. But the reason he won is not TikTok, but his message, right? Yes. But the liberals are saying, the TikTok, we must ban TikTok, we must impose censorship on the social media and controls and checks and fact checking and all that. And then he say, we need to do like in Romania. So what did they do in Romania? Because they didn't like the candidate that had won the first round and was likely to win the second round, they canceled the election. Yeah. They canceled the first round. So in the name of freedom of expression, they propose censorship. In the name of democracy, they propose canceling the election.
However, Trump is Hitler, Putin is Hitler, everyone else is Hitler. and
they are progressive and liberal.
Of course. It's just because people are just not equipped to voting. I just want to add to that, although we should really wrap up because it's late. But there's a quote. There's a guy called Robert Kaplan. He's written an article. He's written a book that's coming out soon. He's written an article. It's called The Edge of Anarchy. It's the front page of the New Statesman, which is a liberal thing. Now, the article is a bit confused and it's a bit cryptic the way that it's written, but they interviewed him. And here's what he said. He's an academic. He's a very important, he's been editing, I believe, Stratfor. He's written for foreign policy, foreign affairs. He's one of these guys who's in the foreign policy, quite a prominent strategist, liberal strategist. And this is what he says. He said, since the 80s, essentially something happened. America became a pure democracy. This is from his YouTube interview. says the founding fathers were actually afraid of pure democracy. Madison was against it. He wanted a republic, not a democracy. What's the difference? The difference is in a republic, the elites decide, but the people get to change the elites every 4 years. And for decades, the party the party leaders in smoke-filled rooms decided who would be the candidates for president, and they thought that this was sorry, the transcript is quite bad. Oh yeah, you might think that this is undemocratic and sleazy, but it actually worked very well. Had those party leaders still been in power in 2017, in 2016, Trump would never have been the Republican nominee. Jeb Bush would have been the Republican nominee, and he would have been a good one. Be a very good president, like his father, not like his brother. Essentially, you see, what does it say? We forgot all this, and now we have a pure democracy with primaries for states, which means that the person who wins, he essentially, the most extreme person essentially wins the primaries because it draws out the most extreme voters, i.e. ordinary people.
Rabble.
And here comes the main thing. And so instead of the elites deciding the two candidates, we have democracy deciding it, and the result has been worse than we've talked about. As we've talked about the economic and decline and so on.
Such horror. Democracy. Imagine that. So this is basically the liberals. The liberals are saying that the liberals. I mean, the problem is that all the institutions have become so discredited. People are against all the institutions. And therefore, if you allow democracy, people will vote against these elites in smoke-filled rooms.
Exactly.
And the elites, therefore, draw the conclusion that people shouldn't be allowed to vote or decide the candidates. This is the sum total of liberalism.
Yes, exactly. But as we've said before, this is precisely what's spurring forward class contradictions and raising class consciousness on a higher and a higher level. And I think
what is needed really is an anti-establishment radical alternative on the left, a communist revolutionary alternative.
Yes.
And the problem is that the left is so meek, cowardly, and they just come out in favor of the defense of the Constitution and the defense of all the discredited institutions. And
precisely.
They can never get any
what you
support
need is
for
a
that.
clean sweep.
Yes.
Exactly, which is what we stand for.
Yes.
I think that's a good place to end it. Yeah. We've talked for a bit more than an hour.
Okay.
Thank you very much, Jorge, and for all of you guys who were there live or listening to this at a later stage. We'll be back again, the Against the Stream, next week, Thursday, 3 p.m. London time, as usual.